My mom always liked to do things in her own unique way, and oftentimes it confused my siblings and I. Everyone likes to say that they had a weird upbringing, but I think I had the unique experience that when I was a kid, I was tasked to cut the grass in the yard with a knife. My mom was born in Mexico in 1960. She was one of 7 children, and her siblings gave her the nickname Borona, which means crumb in Spanish. And that was a nickname that was indicative of her small nature, but also her personality. She was a small girl and got bullied by a lot of the children in her town. Her siblings were more willing to get confrontational if they felt disrespected, but my mom stayed passive. In Mexico, she only made it to the 4th grade, after which she began working to help make money for her family. One of her first jobs was working with guitars in a small factory when she was only 11 years old. In her hometown of Paracho, Michoacan, the town was well known for their guitars, but she never learned how to play them, nor did she really have the desire to. Instead, we were told stories about the assembly process. I would stare at her hands whenever she told me the process of using sandpaper to smooth out the body of the guitar, gently rubbing her hands together in demonstration. Her hands were not dainty at all. Sometimes I looked at her hands and was surprised by the small woman they were attached to. They told a story of how she had worked in factories and hard labor her whole life. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be touched by those hands as delicately as she touched those guitars. But she was not that type of parent. As a son of an immigrant, I learned that my family showed love in their own way. She showed love by having an open door policy for our family to come and stay with us if they needed. So growing up, I lived in a rotating cast of cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents who slept in the living room, kitchen, backyard, storage closet, anywhere that we could find a place. All of this in a 2-bedroom rental that I lived in with my parents and 4 siblings. Space in our home was limited, but this did not prevent my mom from adding to the clutter. She spent her free time going to thrift stores and garage sales so that she could buy stuff to sell later. She kept boxes in the yard, the side of the house, all of our closets, and even our van were full of things that she bought to sell on the weekends. Ironically, even though she was a bit of a hoarder, she hated that we had so much stuff. She felt like if we had less things, it would be easier to manage. So using her logic, she decided that the best way to deal with the clutter was to sell our dishware or to hide our socks. Less things meant less to clean or wash and less to make dirty. After all, you can't have a sink full of dishes if there isn't any dishes. I would be frustrated trying to get ready for school in the mornings as I was trying to find socks to wear for the day. One time I went up to my mom and I asked her what happened to all of my socks. She said, "You and your brother left them all over the place, so I threw them out." I didn't even know what I was supposed to say to this. I was in elementary school at the time. It's not like I could replace them or do my own laundry. We didn't have a washer at our house. So my solution was to sneak into her room before school and borrow her socks. My mom caught on to this and figured out the best course of action was to buy herself more feminine socks in an effort to avoid me taking hers. Unfortunately, this was not the deterrent she hoped for. Owning things was complicated in this kind of environment. My mom knew that our possessions could be used for profit if she needed it. Our home was simply too small to facilitate all of us, and there was no plans to move to a bigger place or to stop housing relatives all the time. My books, my movies, toys had no sentimental value to her, and she grew up with having so little that she figured we could survive without so much. Some things like my VHS of the Power Rangers movie could be given to one of her friend's children, and that's fine because we didn't need it. It was nice to sacrifice for other people and not complain about it. She valued being useful to people. The feud with my mom continued as I got older. I wasn't like my older sisters who helped her when she needed somebody to translate or to fill out paperwork or to talk to authority figures. These were things that she struggled with, and whenever the idea was presented for her to try to learn to do some stuff on her own, she would reject it. She would say that she was not capable of those things. Things like improving her writing, reading, or even simple tasks like working the remote to the TV. My mom would just say that she's not smart, that she only made it to the 4th grade, she didn't speak English, and that nothing we did to try to explain to her how easy it was could convince her otherwise. She felt limited by what she was able to do because she had been a borona her whole life. And all that self-doubt and insecurity rubbed off. In third grade, we had a project where we drew pictures and a short story to show the process in our writing for a back-to-school night. The assignment was pretty straightforward. Most of the other kids drew themselves, their families, or some hobby they enjoyed. I drew a sad alien and a paragraph about his life on his empty planet. An early sign that I probably needed some help. Parents filled the classroom of my elementary school looking at our little exhibit. I pointed out the picture on the wall, and my mom noted that my handwriting was not as nice as some of the other children's. I was failing as a boy. My mom thought that boys would just naturally grow up and know how to do boy things at some point. She saw other men that knew how to build things or work on cars or be good at negotiating and smooth talking. I was a shy kid. I was a borona myself, and I was getting bullied all the time. I had little self-confidence. I didn't like sports or cars, and I wasn't loud or tough. I like to use my imagination. I like to sing and write. So what could we do? We had a yard with grass and weeds and no real knowledge on how to manage it. We didn't own a lawnmower, a weed whacker. Those are tools that my mom would have deemed too difficult to use. So using her logic and resources, she decided that my brother and I would just cut it with a knife. And we had special backyard knives. We had a block in the kitchen with knives that seemed to have no use for us. We didn't eat steak, so the steak knife seemed like the perfect tool for cutting grass. My little brother and I would regularly spend time in the yard taking handfuls of grass and weeds and sawing through it, stuffing it into plastic bags. And when the bags were full, we tossed them into the gray trash cans instead of the green ones. Why? Because my mom was using the green trash cans for extra storage or big things that we couldn't throw away all at once. If we had something like an old couch that needed to be thrown out, my mom wouldn't think to drive it to the dump or to call the city to schedule a pickup for a large item. Instead, she grabbed her tool of choice, a knife, and cut up the couch or Christmas tree or mattress and slowly threw it away until it was all gone. And the obvious question here would be, why not scissors? Well, we didn't regularly need scissors, but there was always plenty of knives around, enough that we would usually have a little pile of knives in the yard waiting for use. The scissors we did have were for school, and those couldn't really cut through weeds as easily, and if we did have scissors lying around, my mom would sell them. It may also seem like doing this was a punishment, but doing yard work with a knife was a normal chore, like washing our clothes in the bathtub or crushing aluminum cans to sell at the junkyard. Totally normal chores that I assumed everybody did. I try to make the time go by in my imagination. Sitting out in the dirt, I'd imagine action scenes like the ones I saw in movies. My knife would be an action star fighting through waves of plant enemies. As I got older, I settled into the idea that my mom and I would never understand each other. I was into philosophy, science, and the arts, things that were not helpful for lawn maintenance. One time when we were waiting in the car, I asked her if she ever thought about how crazy it is that we live on a planet in space. I stared at her as I watched her process the question, hoping that maybe I tapped into something. But after a brief moment, she said, "I never think about that." And it just seems so strange because that's all I ever think about. Despite some difficulties, my siblings and I have always been very close. We'd regularly assemble at my mom's house even after all of us had moved out. If any of us were ever visiting, we never knocked on the door or called ahead of time. Her home was open anytime we needed a place to go. We gathered together for the holidays, all crammed in the kitchen, eating dinner, standing around the kitchen counter, being so loud that my mom would complain that we were being too noisy. We did Easter eggs in the hunt with the backyard for the kids. If any of us had birthdays, it was a tradition that we went to my mom's house for pizza and ice cream. We worked with what we had. We learned to be helpful and to work with what we had, a skill that we acquired from my mom. In 2014, my wife and I moved into our first place, a 2-bedroom down the street from where I grew up. When we moved in, my mother-in-law wanted to give us her old full-size piano that she had kept in storage for several years. I'd been wanting to learn how to play piano, and a piano would be a great addition to our new home. So we told her that we would take it, and she had some arrangements to have it dropped off that night. When I went out into the morning, I saw this big, ugly piano dumped in our front yard. There were scratches on the cement where the movers tried to roll the piano, but the broken wheels just scratched up the floor. My mother-in-law intended for this to be a gift, but the wood was peeling off the exterior. It was out of tune. It smelled dusty from being in storage so long. It was too heavy for us to get inside the house on our own. So by the time we were able to get a plan, it had rained and the piano got even more ruined. Now it looked like if a piano was a haunted pirate ship. We called a local thrift store to see if they could come and take it, but they inspected it and decided that it was too damaged to resell it. I was gonna have to figure out a way to get rid of it. And this is when all the training that my mom taught me growing up finally came into play. I pushed over the piano onto the front of our house and began to break it apart piece by piece. The rain had weakened it a bit, but this instrument was still very sturdy. Toppling over didn't cause the damage that I had hoped for. I began to break apart the exterior, but once I got inside, I realized there was all these parts that were connected. If I was going to create smaller pieces, I was gonna have to remove the strings and hammers from the metal frame. And I don't know what kind of tools are good for breaking up a piano, so I used a hammer, some pliers, and my old friend, the knife. It took some time, but I was able to slowly take it apart and dispose of the whole thing. I love this idea of taking something that seems way too big and breaking it down a little bit at a time. When I was younger, I felt like a borona. I didn't have a place where I could go to get confidence and assurance that I could accomplish things. But now as an adult, my favorite thing is having a lot of hobbies, because learning new things feels like the superpower my mom didn't know that she had. She had to work her whole life and didn't have time for imagination. But she did have a lot. She was not as incapable as she thought. She grew up a little bit at a time, slowly getting rid of the parts that were holding her back. With the help of her kids, she began to grow and change, and eventually she solved the problem of her yard by getting artificial turf instead. Although she still uses the occasional knife for cutting weeds. 4 years ago, when my wife and I separated, we had a big fight that resulted in me moving out. I saw my mom drive by as I was packing up my car to leave for my new home. She called out to me and saw that I had tears in my eyes. My mom has never been great with words, but in that moment, she let me know that she was there for me and that her home was open whenever I needed it. Thank you.
Keep it going for David Zafra, everybody.